Coming up on this week's show, a massive Sega leak has happened.
A legendary beat-em-up comes to the Neo Geo.
And we celebrate the history of first-person shooters.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you every Friday with our amazing friends at Bitmap Books. Now, maybe you've got a holiday coming up soon, you want some good poolside reading, or just something for the garden this summer. The Secret History of Mac Gaming, the Expanded Edition. Now, you can celebrate the previously untold history of gaming on the Apple Macintosh with a gorgeous 480-page hardback book featuring more than 250 Mac titles, including some games that started life on that platform that went on to be massive. Myst, SimCity, Shadowgate, and lots more. Even Halo's in there too. So you can check that out and the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 385, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And great to have you joining us for our first show of July, right in the middle of the summer here in the UK. And of course, we're all on a bit of a high after the incredible weekend that we just had. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty much floating on pure caffeine after Ravi's massive event of the weekend. Of course, kickstart the first Amiga show that's happened in almost a decade. Joe, can we give Ravi a little round of applause for an incredibly well-organised event, Ravi? I've got to say hats off to you, mate. It was so good.
Oh, cheers, guys. You know, it was a bit of a blur for me. I'm still trying to recover. I was running around a lot and I kind of shot myself in the foot because I really wanted to go to this event and I didn't even know what was being sold on the tables. You know, there was some cool devices and it was really cool just to see everyone have a good time. And I can't wait to see some of the footage come out and like some of the photos. And also it's good meeting the patrons as well. Really good time. What did you guys think? I
really, really enjoyed it. I was kind of glued to our stand all day because of Dan, you know, Mr. Popular, kept on getting like torn away and stuff like that. But I had a really great time, like you say, talking to a lot of patrons, a lot of people just coming over and saying they're fans of the show, or even just coming over and having no idea who I am and just being like, why you got a table of PS1 games that you're selling with an Amiga CD32 on here, what you're playing as well? Just like, and then it was just a fun day, just kind of telling people what I was doing and who I was and stuff like that. But like you say, a load of patrons there, which is really awesome. A lot of friends of the show and a lot of people we've made personal friends with. Huge shout out to you all. I really want to sit here and just be like, you know, list everybody off, but, you know, Gideon, Tommy, Pete, Darren, Ian, Chris, just so many people. I'm really sorry if I missed people's names and stuff like that. But yeah, it was amazing. It was so fun.
You know, I'd like to thank also the user groups as well and all the traders that came up and the sponsors, because that whole user group section was just absolutely awesome. It was like I kind of left them to it and then I came back and there was all these amazing setups going on. So that was really good to see. And the after party was the time that I could kind of relax. And yeah, that was mental. I think I've still got the hangover from then.
We did get a message on Discord from Gideon, one of our patrons who was at the after party. So the highlight for him was thrashing Joe at Street Fighter 2 after having 6 pints. That's a moment he's always going to treasure.
Thrashing? Right.
Sorry, he said beating. Sorry, beating. Sorry,
beating.
Quite that aggressive.
He did beat me. I think he beat me twice in a row after I beat him about 6 times in a row, 8 times in a row.
Yeah, all right.
You know, let's just get that out there. But no, it was a wicked after party as well. Really, really cool venue, and it was packed. Like I got there. Yeah. I got there a little bit late because I went home and had some dinner and saw my wife and my baby. You know, I hadn't seen in like 2 days at this point. But I came back out like 8:30 and saw Ravi, you just looked knackered, but you were still running around like a headless chicken. And then I went into the event. Like there was quite a few people outside, and I went inside, and it was just absolutely rammed. Well over 100 people there. And then I think one of the highlights of my night, other than you know, being thrashed on Street Fighter 2 with Gideon, was I turned around at one point and I look at it, I was like, this music's mental, this is like full-on rave happening. And I look over and Ravi's on the decks, Hoffman's on the decks. I'm really sorry I forgot his name, but you know, the Game Boy guy who was playing...
Harley Likes Music.
All 3 of you just on the decks on the stage. Like I was like, this is mental, and like everybody was dancing. Yeah, it was amazing. It was so good.
well, you know what? It went better than I expected, and I'm definitely going to do it next year. So, yeah, if you missed it this time, hopefully see you next year.
Yeah, and actually the event train continues next month, 19th and 20th of August. Retro Messe, heading over to Norway. Unfortunately, that clashes with a family party that I committed to about 6 months ago, annoyingly. Although Ravi's going out there with Neil from RMC, who I did meet on Friday night for first time I've seen him in a while, and he was like, he said, Dan, I'll take a bullet for you, mate. I'll have the trip to Norway if I have to go out there instead of you. He looked devastated that he had to do it, but someone's got to step in. So I know you and Neil are going to have an amazing time out there. So if you're in the Norway area in Sandefjord, it's always a great event happening on the 19th and 20th of August. Ravi and Neil will be up there doing a few panels on stage. Tickets are on sale now, so I'll put that in our show notes. If you can't make it out there, though, of course, we'll be recording a few of them for the podcast as well. Now, we have got a really good show this week, and we're going to be talking to a couple of mates of the show, actually, who we've had on a couple of times before, but we always like catching up with good friends of the podcast when they're doing new projects. And this one is something I've been looking forward to for a good few years now. Now, I'm casting my mind back to my birthday in 2019. So my last birthday, December 2019, before all the madness in the world happened, where we couldn't leave the house for 2 years. Had a great birthday event in London, and I was chatting on email to a guy called Robin Block. Now he messaged us saying that he's working on he had this plan of doing the ultimate movie about first-person shooters. So I was in London, Robin's based in London, went along, met him for a coffee, had a bit of a chat to him about the project, and it sounded awesome. And then I must admit, I kind of lost track of what was going on with it. And then David L. Craddock, who we've had on the podcast before, who's the author of books like, Long Live Mortal Kombat, he did that amazing Arcade Perfect book as well. He also did a book about Quake, didn't he, and first-person shooters. And Richard Moss, who did the Secret History of Mac Gaming and the Shareware Heroes book as well. Turns out these guys are both working on the movie. And after 3 years in production, it weighs in at about 4.5 hours, and it is finally finished. And my God, I watched half of it last night when they sent me a screener. If you love first-person shooters, this lives up to the title, The Ultimate FPS Documentary. So I thought we'd get the guys on just for, a bit of reminiscing about kind of where the FPS genre came from and find out a bit about this movie that I think, like I said, anyone that just loves video games, anyone that loves first-person shooters, whether it be modern stuff, whether it be like classics like Halo or Doom, is going to find this really interesting. Because I don't know about you guys, to me, my kind of FPS journey, I really didn't really see much of first-person shooters until Wolfenstein 3D. But actually, the history of it goes back over 40 years, back to the 70s.
Oh, really? Yeah, I was a very kind of Unreal Tournament guy, so I totally got into Unreal Tournament in that era, and also Quake as well. And I love FPSs, and just looking at the list of people that are featured in this documentary, it's just absolutely mental. One of the favourite ones that they've got there is Warren Spector. But also, yeah. I'd love to see, they've got American McGee in there. They've got Tom Hall, Adrian Carmack as well. Of course, you've got John Carmack in there as well. And
John Romero.
Yeah, John Romero. And the list goes on. It's got Ken Silverman in there as well, who developed the build engine. I can't wait to watch this.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It actually goes way back to about 1973, 1974 with a game called Maze that then became Maze Wars, and it kind of covers stuff like Battlezone and even kind of some of these early games on the Mac as well, like Colony. And then obviously we're going to id Software and even the shareware model of FPS games. Because I think that's quite interesting that, Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, they were shareware games originally, weren't they? And they made a fortune when they came out, which that model, I don't know if you remember shareware, Joe, but basically it was, they give you a couple of levels free. Then you had to register the game, send a postal order, or in the case of David, when we talked to him, he actually got his mum when he was 11 years old to ring up and give a credit card number over the phone to id Software and order the disc. So it was just an incredible time. And obviously as we went through the 90s, it was the FPS really, wasn't it, that then spurred people to buy new PCs, and 3D graphics cards came in, and it was kind of that constantly upgrading, and even the fun aspect of FPS games as well. When multiplayer came in and LAN parties,
networking,
yeah, even the couch stuff. GoldenEye. Whenever we're around Joe's house, always gets the N64 out. We'll blast out a bit of GoldenEye, and absolutely kicks our ass when we play it. But yeah, so we do cram a lot into here. So it's a real celebration, reminiscing with David and Richard about the history of first-person shooters, and also talking about this incredible new movie that actually you can order from today. So when the podcast comes out on Friday. So I'll put a link in our show notes if you want to check that out as well. Now, before we get into that, of course, lots of news stories to keep it up to speed on. That's what we do in the first half of the podcast because, it's always busy. in the world of retro. There's always lots going on, and we get that, people have got lives, they've got jobs, but we save you the job, we save you the effort. So the first one this week, now this is, normally we used to see leaks from Nintendo, but I've no idea where this has come from. This is possibly the biggest leak I've ever seen come out of Sega.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? So this is a 272-page PDF that has just appeared it's landed on Sega Retro Wiki this week. So it came out yesterday at the point of recording this. And nobody really knows where it's come from. It's just appeared on there, which I kind of like. I like the mystery behind it. But it's a document from the mid-90s, and there's a few kind of like highlights in there, on PCGamer.com that I've got here, kind of like, what they've highlighted. Because obviously I've not read it, 272 pages, but I'm going to have a proper look through it. But you've got, product planning reports, storyboards from games, different kind of advertisements, some business strategies in there, some reviews of games. One really interesting bit is talking about the scrap value of the 32X, how much it would be if they scrapped all the 32Xs and how much money they could make back from it. But the kind of like two of the big things that have come from it, an email from Tom Kalinske, who was obviously the CEO of Sega America at the time, around the time of the Sega Saturn coming out in Japan, but before it came out in America, or around the same time it came out in America. And the headline is, "We are killing Sony." I think it is. Yeah, "We are killing Sony."
Yeah.
Which, when I first read that sounded like, it was a plan to kill Sony, like a plan to like take them down kind of thing. But what it is essentially is him sending an email saying how well the Sega Saturn is doing in Japan. And, that it's crushing Sony. You go into the shops in Japan, the stores in Japan, and the Sega Saturn sold out everywhere, and there's just stacks and stacks of PlayStations sitting on the shelves, etc. And this email, I think, is March 1995, and it points out that by the July, he'd stepped down as CEO, which is kind of sad. And, obviously, over the years, he's kind of said it, it was from kind of like, he was kind of forced out, and, from them forcing out the Sega Saturn in America too soon, 5 months early, and all that kind of stuff. But it just kind of cements that, people forget the Sega Saturn was actually really popular in Japan.
Yeah.
It sold a lot better in Japan, and it had hundreds of more releases in Japan than it ever did in America.
Why do you think that was? Do you think it was because of the like RPG connection that it had?
Yeah, I think Japan probably embraced a little bit more of the wackiness of the Sega Saturn as well. A lot of FMV games, and a lot of like there was a lot of games that you could like bet on and gamble on and stuff like that. Like a lot of horse racing games and stuff, and it obviously had internet connectivity over there and stuff like that. So there's that element of it.
Maybe the video card as well, because
I was literally about to say that, the video card element of it. And then also there's a lot of RPGs and a lot of 2D games, a lot of 2D arcade ports, whereas in the Western world, 3D was the future. The Sega Saturn's such a 2D powerhouse, and that was still kind of so, embraced and big in Japan at the time. So quite a few contributing factors there, but I'm going off topic here. But yeah, I'm just really interested to see where this 272-page PDF has kind of come from.
Yeah, I mean, I've been through quite a lot of this.
Okay.
I kind of skim read, probably 70% of it. And it's interesting, so some stuff in here as well, they're talking about kind of how they're going to position the Saturn to go up against the PlayStation. They're talking about, the fact that the price must be like close enough to the PlayStation. I think they're talking about $249 initially. They're saying that's got to be added visually and verbally. There's actually storyboards in here of planned TV adverts. Now, I must admit, I'm not all that familiar on the American Sega Saturn TV adverts, but one of them was going to be called the airport advert, and there's another one called Armageddon.
Oh, gosh.
And they're quite interesting to look at as well. And really, they're kind of going up against, obviously, the N64's coming out and the PlayStation's on the market. The way they're trying to position the Saturn is for like the serious games player, and they're focusing heavily on stuff like Virtua Fighter 2, Panzer Dragoon as well, and they're looking at stuff like really going big on the sporting titles on there. But then further on into this document, they actually kind of break down some of the kind of the beta versions of some of these games I've seen already, and kind of attack them on the areas where they're not very strong. and say what needs to be done. And that there is a real urgency in this as well. And it's mentioned quite a lot through it that we need stuff like, Nights into Dreams, Sonic the Hedgehog needs to be on here. We need Virtua Cop 1 and 2 needs to be on here, but we need the deadline to bring it forward. These games need to be out 6 months earlier than they're planned right now. And we need, at least 5 exclusives on launch to go up against Sony. So they're really saying that, they wanted to kind of focus on the Saturn being the serious games players machine, and also kind of focusing on, some of those big Sega brands as well that Nintendo and Sony couldn't compete with. So it's interesting because, obviously around this time, they're panicking about the fact that they haven't got much third-party support, and they're talking about the fact that some developers were siding with Sega because Sony weren't giving them the support that they wanted. But I think, that distribution that obviously Sega already had in place probably looked good at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that they're talking about the retail margin here, and they're saying that retailers only made $15 per Saturn that was actually sold.
Yeah, that's interesting because that kind of like, with the whole $2.99 thing with the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn was $3.99, that just goes to show like that was probably as cheap as they could possibly make it then. Do you know what I mean? Like if retailers are only making $15 off it, unless, Sega were making like a huge amount of money prior to that, maybe, it cost $200 to make, and then, they keep 175 and then 185 and then retailers get 15. Who knows? But I can't imagine that was the case. They usually sell, especially these days, hardware, I guess, on the margin, and then they make the money off the software, don't they? So, and the transactions and stuff like that. So, yeah.
They're even talking about the fact they want to prioritize, the internet add-on. They want to get that ready for E3 and show that off. Thought that would be a big selling point. They want to position Sega as like, a web-first company, put a lot of focus into the website, which made sense.
Sega
95, 96.
Yeah.
Yeah, that did seem like, obviously it was probably a bit early, but they weren't to know that then. But it's a really interesting document. It goes through, you can see stuff like, product inventory and how much it costs for all the various components, and staffing issues they had, the fact that they lost 3 managers in the last 3 months, and the impact that's going to have on quotas. And it's proper in depth, and it's even got performance reviews and stuff in here too. So it's wherever this has come from, it was definitely someone who was firmly on the inside, or someone who's managed to hack into one of Sega's servers and found all this stuff on there. But wherever it's come from, if it has, obviously we don't endorse that behaviour, but like we said with the Nintendo leak as well, it's always interesting to look into this stuff. And I wonder, because it has been that long now, 1995, 1996, it does, it was an eternity ago in gaming. So I think whether Sega will be all that bothered now, maybe even, someone from Sega had the permission to release it,
I don't know if all the staff's still around anyway, so I don't know if it'll be relevant,
But yeah, very interesting to see. And it'll be interesting to see if any more comes out over the next few weeks as well. So if you have got a bit of time this weekend, I will link up that PDF in our show notes, along with the rest of the stories at theretrohour.com. I was very pleased to see this news, even though I haven't got a Neo Geo, but I do love this game. I've got a Neo Geo CD, actually. But this title, unfortunately, looks like it's going to only be on cartridge. But this is that wonderful Final Vendetta beat-em-up from Bitmap Bureau that came out. Was it last Christmas that game came out? Christmas before?
I think it was last Christmas. Yeah, I think it was last Christmas, because I was... no, when was it? It might have been the Christmas before, because I remember us playing it on the plane to Norway last year. So I think it was... Right, yeah. So it was about a year and a half ago now, I think it came out, yeah.
Well, for those who didn't play it, it's basically if you love games like, Streets of Rage, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, those kind of side-scrolling, what do you call them, belt-scrolling fighting games, beat-em-up games. One of those, a modern game, very, very difficult. I must admit, it thrashes me every time I play it. I'm definitely not the best at it. But obviously, if you're a fan of the Neo Geo, I imagine that you probably got into these games and probably a bit of a hardcore gamer. And it turns out they're actually going to be porting the game to the Neo Geo AES and even the MVS arcade systems as well.
Yeah, this is going to be like a real collector's piece. This is kind of like, it's very rich, and it's funny, it's interesting, because obviously when we were all younger, when we were kids and teenagers and stuff like that, only very rich people had a Neo Geo, a Neo Geo AES.
Everyone knew someone whose cousin had one.
Yeah, everybody knew, and that still is the case, and it definitely is for the games. A quick eBay search, and you will see both the AES and the MVS games are really, really expensive. So it kind of goes with the mood of things. So this is it's got to be £394.80, or I think €400. for this. So it is going to be quite expensive, but like I say, it comes with the territory of the Neo Geo. So
are these carts expensive to kind of produce then as well?
They're like arcade boards.
They're like arcade boards. They're massive.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the AES one is the Neo Geo AES is the home one. And the cartridge is probably like A5, but taller, isn't it? Like an A5 piece of paper, but they're about an inch wide, aren't they? Inch deep, aren't they? Down, and then they're about 7 inches tall? They're big.
Yeah.
They're big. And then the MVS one was the arcade board, but it was still a cartridge, but it was swappable. That's why the Neo Geo MVS was like such a lucrative, cool, ahead of the times machine in the 90s, because you could swap the arcade boards out easily from just like a cartridge form. It's just a massive cartridge. So it's really cool to see it come into the Neo Geo, because when we spoke to them about this, when we spoke to Bitmap Bureau about this, they said, they needed to make this game. They wanted to make it as beautiful as possible, and the animation in it, because the pixel animation in it is absolutely fantastic. I've got it for the Switch. Really, really, really good looking game. Really animated well. But they said, they had to make sure that it could run on the Neo Geo, because it will come out on the Neo Geo eventually. And it just kind of goes to show that this hardware, which is from 93, 94, something like that, is just, push, how far you can push it and it still be on a cartridge. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, you get it in the box, like an actual kind of proper plastic box like you would back in the day. I think it's the MVS one, which is more expensive. That does just come in a cardboard sleeve. But there is an option for an upgraded package where, I think it's about £20-30 more, where you do get it in the plastic box, but then you also get the soundtrack with it and stuff like that on CD. So
Utah Saints, wasn't it?
Yeah, Utah Saints did, I think, 2 or 3 tracks on there, some boss tracks and stuff, which is really cool. But yeah, man, £394.80, like I say, it comes with the territory of the Neo Geo, but still wicked to see, such a kind of obscure but awesome kind of piece of kit.
Oh, that's coming from the UK as well, because it's Bitmap Bureau. So that's quite interesting to see Neo Geo stuff being produced in the UK.
I love that the MVS arcade version as well. Some of the features they list are dip switch setting sheet, because obviously you had to do the dip switches in arcades back in the day, and a reflective caution sticker.
Oh, really? That's funny.
Very cool. Yeah, so like you said though, Joe, these are just, they're going to be collector's items, aren't they? But I think the fact that this game was made from the ground up to actually originally, they had that Neo Geo aesthetic, and the fact that it has to run on that machine in mind.
It's very much for the hardcore though, isn't it, this?
Oh yeah, 100%, yeah. You can buy it on the Switch for like a tenner. If you just want to play the game, I wouldn't fork out 400 quid for it on the Neo Geo if all you want to do is have a quick blast of it. But for collectors, it's very cool. So you can, I think you nip onto their website right now. They're expected to ship that between Q4 of this year and Q1 of 2024. So I'll put a link to that in our show notes as well. Now, thank you to Gareth, who submitted this in our Discord. We do have a little Discord server. If you want to hop on there, there is a channel in there where you can suggest news stories to talk about on the podcast. So we all see a few in there every week, and it helps us out, because we can't keep our eyes everywhere, so it's quite handy to have a few extra ones. This is quite a cool little article, though, on a modern gaming website called custompc.com. Well, actually, it's all about PC building, but obviously the gaming's a big kind of focus on the website too. And there's an article here by a writer called Edward Chester, and the title is CRT is still king of the gaming monitors. Fact. So interestingly, he's got what looks to be a gorgeous 21-inch Sun CRT
that's very
monitor.
nice, that one is.
Yeah, it looks, flat screen as well. I'm not sure whether the Sun ones are based on some kind of Trinitron technology. I've got a similar looking one that's a Mitsubishi one. It's got their Diamondtron, which is based on Trinitron technology with the flat screen. But yeah, so basically what he's done is, it's a bit of an experiment really. He swapped his modern gaming monitor for this nice old school Sun CRT, and attempts to do both some modern gaming and some retro gaming, and talks about the advantages of it. Now, I think, for those of us who are into retro gaming, we obviously know stuff like, the fact that LCDs have native resolution.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you want to play a retro game on an LCD, it's still got to kind of blow it up to that resolution, but instead of, they mentioned in this article, instead of a pixel being 1 pixel on the screen, it will blow it up so it covers like 4 different pixels, so it fills the screen. So it always means that games that are not designed to run at the native resolution of an LCD screen always tend to look a bit blocky and washed out. Whereas on a CRT, they can kind of adjust to any resolution that, as far as it can go up to anyway. So, interestingly, the assessment of this is, He plays modern games with it. Obviously, there are problems with using a CRT for modern games. The main one being that most of them are not widescreen. So, you're going to have to, if you're playing like the latest Call of Duty on there, it's, you're not going to be playing it in 4K or 1080p. You're going to have to scale it down to 4:3 format to play in a modern CRT. He also mentioned something like, obviously a lot of modern LCD screens now, the refresh rate is pretty high. I mean, I think you can get like 240 hertz LCD screens now. And I think, my CRT goes up to about 100, which, for playing classic games is fine, but you might get a bit of motion blur if you're used to playing at high resolutions. But then he goes into playing retro games on there, and that's where his opinion completely changes. He said, the sharpness and the smoothness that you get on low-resolution games makes it so much better than even the best LCD screens.
Yeah, well, a lot of them were designed with that in mind, and it's really good. But he's also talking about, buying them and stuff, and it can be quite tough. I don't know if you've ever got a CRT kind of delivered to your house. The way that they're packaged can sometimes be questionable. I've seen awful images of like CRT smashed up that people have bought on eBay and stuff, and delivery drivers haven't really cared that there's a old CRT in there and it's just been completely trashed.
Yeah, because I've got my that 21-inch CRT that I've got. I actually went to pick that up from, it was a guy that was a graphic designer in Derby about 10 years ago, and it was a token gesture thing. I'd give him £1 for it. And I went to pick it up, and that monitor would have sold for, £700-800 when it was new. So it was a very nice screen. But it was that era, wasn't it? Like a decade or so ago, you could get really good bargains on CRTs. I remember
people were just chucking them out. People were just literally leaving them on the street. It was pretty mad.
Well, I remember you getting haven't you got a Commodore like 1942 or 1960?
Yeah, 1942, yeah.
What did you get that for when you bought it? That was about a decade
about 50
ago,
quid, I think. Yeah, and another one,
on one of those.
I went to see a play, and I think it was a Commodore 1080, and I was sitting there watching the props on the stage, and I was like, there's a nice CRT. And I went to the technicians, and I said, oh, you've got a Commodore monitor there. I'll pay you a couple of quid. They just said, have it. Like that. Right. And I just went off with it, and I've still got that. Really good.
Because I was bidding on one of those Commodore monitors not long ago, actually. And I think it went to 200 quid and I bowed out. So the price of them now, I think, because it's, like you said, a lot of people threw them out. So they're getting quite scarce. But interestingly, if you go on, sites like Reddit and a lot of gaming forums as well, there's definitely a movement of kind of CRT connoisseurs, who at least have one CRT on their desk. I see that quite a lot now.
I've started to see the PVMs quite a lot. Even at the Kickstart show, I saw quite a few really nice PVMs, and they're amazing.
Yeah, they look gorgeous with, the old school RGB games. So, no, Joe, you got a couple of CRTs. Are you still using those? I know you've kind of had to move into your smaller room recently.
I've got one wrapped up in the attic at the moment, and then I've just got an old, Sony 14-inch with the VHS player built into the bottom of it. Yeah. But I've got it. I've yet to use it. But I've got it set up in my new little office. But it's on the top, like these IKEA, is it called a clacks? Like where it's like, and it's got like the 5 kind of slots high and you can put the drawers in it. It's on top of one of them. So it's like optimum height for standing and playing with a light gun. And that was the idea. Like I'll put it up there and then I'll set the PS2 up and I'll play like Time Crisis 2 and, maybe there's some Dreamcast like House of Dead and stuff. And I've just not done it yet.
well, they always used to... They always used to attract cats as well because they were like hot. Yeah. And, the cats would go up there, crawl in it, and then you get loads of cat hair in the CRT. I remember that.
Yeah, I've seen that great meme of a cat draped over a CRT in 1995, and then in 2015, a cat trying to drape over a flat screen, like 40-inch telly. Doesn't look the most comfortable, but it is nice to see that, there are still people that, do appreciate CRTs, and I just kind of feel like there's, definitely a movement towards people actually seeing the benefits of them now, because back in like 2005, 2006, like all of us, I couldn't wait to get rid of mine. I remember I had a CRT monitor on my main PC, and then there was a computer store down the end of our street, and my housemate came back and he's like, they're selling LCD monitors now for like 150 quid in there. So it's finally affordable to go and buy them. So we both bought them that day. And then I had this massive 21-inch CRT. I took it to work and kind of just dumped it in the IT department room. And then, I remember the head of IT giving me a bit of a bollocking going, why did you leave that in there? We saw you on the cameras doing it, bringing it in on a Sunday night.
Well, those 21-inch ones were absolutely giant as well, weren't they? As they got bigger, they got weightier and heavier. And I used to have it on top of the Amiga 4000. And I was like, is this going to take the weight?
I remember he said, he's like, I said, I thought you might want a use for it. You might find a use. He's like, no, I'll recycle it for you. Not that I think there was much to recycle in those monitors back then, but it's good to see that people are still, caring for them. And even though they are becoming a bit scarce and a bit more expensive, if you have got CRTs, keep them going because, for retro games, they do look better. I'm going to put that out there. I know people will argue. Now, let's talk about this before we chat about first-person shooters with our special guest this week. I'm always a big fan of Double Dragon games. We were talking about this actually, weren't we, Joe? That we were talking about Double Dragon games that we liked. You weren't a fan of Double Dragon 3, is that right?
Yeah, you know what? I was. I've been playing Sega Mega Drive with my daughter recently, and I put on a Double Dragon 3, the Sega Mega Drive version, obviously, and the Sacred Stones is it, or I think it's called, or the
Rosetta
Stones. That's it. And we borrowed it or rented it when we were children, me and my brother, and I remember it being really tough and. It's got a bit of a name for itself and not being the best game these days. And I played it and it's just janky, man. Like, I really like the art style in it and I really like the sound and everything, but just the fighting in it, like, it just doesn't work. Like, I was like, am I playing? I even swapped controllers around. I was like, this is going terribly. This is really hard. Like, you just get completely, like, overrun, by so many people. But you said you really liked it.
It might be a case of rose-tinted spectacles. My brother and I used to play it on the Amiga. We played it loads back in the day. Haven't really played it for about maybe 20 years, maybe a bit longer. So maybe I need to boot it up and give it another try. But in my mind, that was always kind of my favourite, apart from the original one on the arcade. Yeah, that was probably my
I always
Double Dragon game.
Enjoyed the home versions. Like back in the days, it was always nice to whip it out and be like, Double Dragon.
Yeah, there's Double Dragon 4 as well, I believe it was. It came out on the Switch a few years ago. And I think it was Double Dragon Neon as well.
It was Double Dragon, was it 4? Yeah, it was 4, wasn't it? Yeah. Was it 5?
Oh, the 5's the one on the Jaguar, I think, which is that weird kind of... It's more like a Street Fighter kind of game.
Yeah, you're right. There was Double Dragon, there was Super Double Dragon for the Super Nintendo, and then there was Double Dragon 5 for Super Nintendo as well, and then there was Double Dragon for the Neo Geo. And Jaguar, like you say, just a bit all over the place. But there was Double Dragon.
Yeah, numerically, it's all over.
Yeah, but Double Dragon 4 was the last one we got in 2017. But we are now getting Double Dragon Gaiden, Rise of the Dragons, at the end of this month. And apparently this was announced a little while ago. And I only noticed it because it was on my Xbox home screen. Recommended I download it ready for Game Pass at the end of this month. And I was like, well, we've got to talk about that.
So Billy and Jimmy are back, and they're going to be... what about this for an original storyline? They're going to take on the New York City gangs.
All right, yeah.
Save the world after a nuclear war, this one, though. So it's quite different to previous games.
The mutant gangs.
So graphically, I've got to say, it doesn't look like any of the previous Double Dragon games that I've played. Definitely a unique art style to it, but I do really like it. It looked very cartoony, this one.
You know what? At first glance, so I looked at it and I was like, I don't like this. Like within the first 10 seconds, I was like, I don't really like the look of this. And then the more I watched it and looked at it, I was like, you know what? This graphically, the graphic style of this actually makes sense, because if you kind of cast your mind back to the original kind of arcade or Master System NES versions of Double Dragon 1 and 2, they've got like a bit of a... So the reason I didn't like this art style, this art design, was they kind of had like big heads, like their heads didn't look in proportion. I was like, it looks a bit chibi. But when you look back, that's what they look like in the original Double Dragon 1 and 2. They've got that kind of crunched down look. And I was like, actually, this is probably just a natural progression of that art style, of that design. It's just now the beautiful pixel version of it, like, on modern console. So it grew on me in a matter of a couple of minutes, but I really like it now, like looking back at it.
And I think gameplay style as well. I mean, it kind of looks, really, really slick. A lot of different enemies on here as well. A load of weapons. Some very over-the-top weapons by the looks of it, too.
Rocket launchers and stuff, yeah.
Yeah, which is always fun to see. And again, I mean, I've only watched, there's a little, it's kind of a minute 20 gameplay footage, and you kind of see, some of the different maps in here as well, on top of a train, on a cliffside as well. You can get, like you could in some of the older Double Dragon 3, there was a shop you could go to and buy things, wasn't there, upgrades and things. Looks like you can in here as well. There's exploding barrels, some of the old school bosses are in here as well, by the looks of it, which is quite nice to see. Got a lot of punks in here. You play on, obviously, there's always a scene on these retro beat-em-ups where you're on a moving underground train.
Yeah.
Gotta be.
It's gotta be. Yeah. Either a train or a lift towards the end. Yeah. Some extra characters as well. Uncle Matin and, is it Marion? I think her name is. Which, look quite unique. Marion, the woman, she's got guns and stuff as a default, and then Uncle Matin has a riot shield, which looks quite interesting. But yeah, coming out at the end of this month.
July 27th.
Yeah, July 27th. And like I say, straight to Game Pass on Xbox, but also coming out on, PlayStation, Steam, etc., which is nice to see. And Switch. And couch co-op as well, which is always good.
Yeah. I'm just noticing as well how croaky all of our voices are because we've been shouting and stuff,
Yes, that's from singing along to John Hare's set probably on Saturday night. But yes, I always love these couch beat 'em ups, and that to me is essential. That's in there as well, Joe. It's got to be, it's got to have the couch mode in there, hasn't it? Online play's cool, but you want to punch your mate in the arm when he beats you. That's what we like. So if you want to get hold of that, it comes out end of this month. I'll link that up, and everything else we talk about, you'd have to Google around to save you the job. Check out your podcast show notes app, or head to our website at theretrohour.com. Now, this week's special guest, David L. Craddock and Richard Moss, they're coming up in just a moment. We're going to be talking about their amazing new first-person shooter documentary. Just before we do that, let's take a second to give a massive thank you to this episode's sponsor, and it is a sponsor that's supported this podcast for many years now, our wonderful friends at ExpressVPN. Now, of course, Netflix, we all know what they've been doing recently, the blocking out your friends from using your passwords or your family members without paying extra money now. And obviously the price of them seems to go up all the time, these services too. The thing about it is, though, even if you are paying, top dollar for your Netflix subscription, you're not getting the full amount of content that you could get, because Netflix has actually got tens of thousands of shows and you're only seeing a fraction of that. For example, what about this for an analogy? Watching Netflix without using something like ExpressVPN, it's kind of like paying for a gym membership, but they only let you use a treadmill. There's a lot more out there, so we want you to try it all. Now, did you know that Netflix have actually got almost 100 different server locations around the world? And due to licensing and regional differences, there is a lot of movies and TV series that are on different Netflix libraries around the world that normally you can't access. But using ExpressVPN, it unlocks all that, doesn't it, Ravi?
Yeah. And, it has a really fast speeds as well. I get zero buffering when I'm using it, and it streams in HD as well. Compatible on all your devices. So with your phones, your laptops, your smart TV, you can kind of have it set up on there, fire it up. And, I've been watching some stuff, just like Pulp Fiction, which is an absolutely awesome film, on the Canadian Netflix, Spirited Away as well, which is an absolutely great anime movie, and Jurassic World on the Hong Kong Netflix.
Yeah, so that's the thing. All you do, it's dead simple to use as well, isn't it? It's literally press a button. It's also got the advantage of encrypting your data, so you can browse the web securely as well. And it is one click, and then it makes it seem like you're in different parts of the world. So it means it unlocks all these libraries. Not just Netflix as well, but other streaming services, even stuff like BBC iPlayer, Hulu, YouTube, all of those as well. So stop paying full price for streaming services and only getting access to a fraction of their content. Get your money's worth. ExpressVPN pays for itself, doesn't it? Because you're getting access to all this much more stuff. So why don't you use our exclusive link and let them know that we sent you. You'll be helping out the podcast for doing it. And get yourself 3 months of ExpressVPN for free on top of a 1-year plan. So use our exclusive link, expressvpn.com/retro. That's expressvpn.com/retro. I'll put that in our show notes as well. And a big thank you to our friends at ExpressVPN for their continued support of our show. A reminder as well that we do have a Patreon that supports this podcast. If you want another way to just basically throw a couple of quid into the tip jar, help us keep the lights on as well. You get lots of extra stuff for your money too. We give you extra few news stories. You get a longer episode each week. We chop all the adverts out. You get it ad free. You get it early when we can get it edited in time. And also, if you join us as a gold member or above, you get access to an exclusive bonus podcast of we're going to be recording a new episode of this, 36 episodes of the Retro Hour After Hours. So all the details to join us on Patreon are on our website right now at theretrohour.com. Right, then next we're going to be going inside the world of first-person shooters, celebrating this incredible new documentary with a couple of the guys who are behind it, and they're good friends of the podcast. David L. Craddock and Richard Moss are our guests next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And actually, it is two friends of the podcast who it's always nice to catch up with because they've worked on some incredible projects over the years. And this one could be the biggest one to date because we're going to be talking about the ultimate FPS documentary with David L. Craddock, who's an author of titles like Long Live Mortal Kombat and the brilliant Arcade Perfect book, and Richard Moss, who of course we spoke to when he did the Secret History of Mac Gaming, and of course that incredible Shareware Heroes book as well. So nice to have you guys back on. Welcome, David and Richard.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Good to be here again.
Yeah, nice to have you back on. Now we're going to talk about this massive new documentary for fans of first-person shooters. I think this really is the best love letter I've seen to that genre. I mean, you guys sent me a screener copy over yesterday, and that clocks in at around 4.5 hours already. And I've got to say, it was so gripping. I'm already like halfway through it, just in like the last 12 hours or so. And I know, David, you're the director. You both write and produce on it as well. So let's kind of start with you, David. It'd be interesting, because I know you obviously did that book about first-person shooters, but kind of going back to, your personal relationship with FPS games, where did that kind of come from then before starting on the project?
Yeah, I'll let Richard talk about starting on the project since he actually predates me by 2 or 3 months. But my personal history with first-person shooters dates back to probably sometime in late 1992. I was sick from school, but my mom would not let me stay home alone because she knew I just play computer games. So I had to go with her to her medical transcription class, and I was camped out at a desk in the back of the room. And all the students were doing whatever they were doing there, probably typing, transcribing. And the teacher was this old lady named Sally. So she looks up and she goes, "David." And I was very surprised because this wasn't even my class and I was already in trouble with the teacher. So she said, "Come up here a minute." So I did, and she showed me the game she was playing. And she was just running down this corridor like 1,000,000 miles an hour, blasting Nazis. And that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. So she gave me the floppy disks for Wolfenstein 3D Shareware episode, and I've been shooting Nazis and demons and aliens and anything else in front of me ever since.
What about you, Richard?
David's a few years older than me, so I was too young for Wolfenstein 3D. But I remember quite early on the family Macintosh playing a game called Spectre, a wonderful tank shooter, sort of like Battlezone, where you've got first-person wireframe view, and you go around and you're shooting like these other sort of triangular 3D tanks. And I loved that. I could play that for hours, just scooting around the arena, picking up the little green disc thingies that make a nice sound when you pick them up, and going through the levels. And then shortly after that, I had a game called Super Maze Wars, which was, as the name would suggest, a maze game. First-person maze game. It was a descendant of the original FPS Maze from back in the 70s, but jazzed up to the new era a bit. And then a couple of years after that, I got introduced to first-person shooters proper through Marathon and Duke Nukem 3D, and I think I saw Doom around then as well.
Amazing. Well, I mean, obviously, we're going to get into some of the games that you cover in the documentary, but it'd be nice to find out why you guys got involved in a documentary about the evolution of first-person shooter games, because I know this has been in the works for quite a few years now. So, how did you get on board, Richard?
So, I got an email out of the blue from Robin Block, our executive producer. I'd never met him, never talked to him before, and I didn't know what he wanted, but I've got this email in my inbox. This is about the end of February, early March 2021. And he's just saying that he'd started working on this documentary about first-person shooters, and he'd like to talk to me. That's all the information I had. And I'm, okay, I'll hop on a call. And in the course of chatting to him about this film, he decided that he wanted me to work on it. And he basically pitched to me on being a writer and producer. Just out of the blue there. from nowhere because he had read one of my articles. He'd read my history of first-person shooters on Ars Technica, which is like a 8,000 word or something like that article that I wrote a few years before that. And then it was maybe a month, 2 months after that, at my suggestion, we brought David on initially as a consultant, and then he sort of just got more and more involved from there.
Yeah, and initially, I attended all the meetings. I gave suggestions when asked for them. And when the time came to put our Kickstarter campaign together, I think the backbone of that campaign, besides the awesome trailer that my co-director Chris Stratton made, was we needed a great cast. And so I worked with Susan Lusty, who's very famous in the video games PR space, and one of her fellow PR managers, and the three of us and Richard, I believe we all four just kind of cast nets as far and wide as we could. I got some people such as John Carmack, who wrote back and said, I usually don't like to come out of my programmer's den for these things, but I like talking to you. So we got him on board. We got John Romero, Cliff Blazinski, a whole bunch of people. So I was pretty happy with the cast we were able to put together. And then the Kickstarter campaign got going, and this was my Robin Block out of the blue experience. Everyone has to have one. And he said, David, I would like you to co-direct with Chris. And I said, I've never directed anything before. I think he said co-write and co-direct. And I said, I'm interested. Why? And he said, well, you've been to all the meetings. And I said, I thought I had to be there. I don't know that that's a criteria for making someone a director, but he explained that he also had gotten Chris's feedback, and Chris wanted to work with me because of a book I wrote, Rocket Jump, and so I just became the co-director, co-writer, and producer, and whatever else they have me do from there.
Well, obviously, for any documentary that wants to tell a story, particularly one as in-depth as this, it spans, over 4 decades. I mean, how did you decide on the structure of the documentary?
Yeah, that comes in large part from Creative VC, this company's previous films. So they'd done In Search of Darkness, which is a really big horror documentary, 1980s horror films, and In Search of Darkness Part 2, and they were in the process of finishing In Search of Tomorrow, which was their sci-fi film. And the idea was that this would be branching out the format to video games. So I had a basic structure, which was that we were supposed to go year by year through the whole history and have these individual segments per title. But because we're doing video games and because we're trying to do an entire genre's history, we had to make some adjustments to make that format work. So initially I wrote a synopsis that was like, okay, this is if everything could go perfectly and we had no time constraints, these are all the games that we would cover. We could get the interviews if we didn't have to worry about any issues. And there's like 100 games on there or something, maybe more. And it was laying out the basic structure, which is essentially that I thought we needed to go back to the very beginning and get to the roots. Let's not start at Wolfenstein 3D. No, that's the game that made the genre what it is. That's what codified the genre. That was the formative game. But the ideas were circling around way before that. And basically the ideas go back to 1973 with a game called Maze, or Maze War, as it's better known today, which was made on a mainframe and a PDP-10 mini computer by a bunch of high school students. And then one of those high school students and some MIT students, one of whom ended up being co-founder of Infocom, the text adventure company, which I always think is just delightful that one of the guys who made Zork invented first-person shooters.
Yeah, that's not a bad claim to fame, inventing adventure games and first-person shooters, is it?
Yeah. And so from there, it's like let's evolve. Let's see how the genre evolves, and let's try and get the big notes, but also periodically go out into like some themed topics.
Well, I love that history as well, because you write him in a lot of kind of smaller documentaries or YouTube series, they generally always start around, the early 90s with Wolfenstein, but it's really interesting to see that kind of 70s and the 80s kind of legacy of the genre as well. And I found the story of Maze quite interesting as well. I mean, for people that are not familiar with that game, is there much in there that we'd recognise from first-person shooters? I heard it's even got like online play as well.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I took most of my cues from the interviews I did with co-creators Greg Thompson and Dave Lebling. Those are two of the co-creators we could get. Took most of my cues from Richard, but I mean, if you look at Maze, you can see online deathmatch. There were bots, AI-controlled bots. You could name your avatars, which was just an eyeball that was added later. Before that, it was just your name kind of floating around. There was a map editor, you could call it. There was a spectate mode just for people to watch. So it actually planted the seeds for a lot of what would become staples in the genre.
And did Battlezone have a lot of influence on the early development of the genre, would you say?
That's one that it was never technically known as a first-person shooter, but Richard and I wanted to include it because it's kind of subversive. Just because you don't think of a game as part of a genre doesn't mean it's not. I actually find genres really restrictive. They're great for marketing people who need bullet points to put on, marketing copy, but the way I looked at Battlezone, the way we both did was, well, it's first person, you're shooting things, and that's why we included it. I think it'll just surprise people and make them kind of rethink what they consider an FPS. There's even, I guess, a sort of a strafing modality too, depending on how awkward or not awkward you found the joystick setup. So it was always kind of tricky for me to play, but I liked it when I tried it. I especially liked the scope that you looked through.
Well, Richard, I know you've obviously covered Mac gaming in depth in the past. Obviously, your amazing book. And the Mac actually contributed to the first-person genre, particularly with one game called Colony, which... Were you a fan of that game back in the day? Because I know that was a bit divisive from what I've seen. It seems to be a bit of a love-hate kind of game. Some people adore it. Other people don't think it deserves its place in the Hall of Fame of first-person shooters, if you like.
Yeah, well, the funny thing about the Colony, and to answer your question, I wasn't into it back in the day because I didn't know about it until I was like a teenager, so many years later. But the thing about the Colony is that it is just sadistic and so hard. David Smith, the guy who made it, he thought, as many designers did in that era, that he had to make the game unnecessarily difficult so that you felt like you were getting your money's worth. You had to derive value by hitting your head against the wall, shouting, "Why does this game hate me?" And so he would throw in things like, you pick up a cigarette, you die instantly, just for the hell of it. And at the very beginning of the game, you're in darkness. You walk up to this panel. It's basically the only thing you can see. And one of the buttons will turn on the light and like power up the ship that you're on so that you can start playing the actual game. The other button will kill you instantly. It's right from the very beginning. And then when you want to get off the ship and out into this area that was sort of inspired by Battlezone, that you have to cross to get to the main part of the game, which is this multi-story building thing, this colony facility. To get out, you got to go through an airlock. And what he didn't realize, actually, this was not something that he intentionally made obtuse, but he thought it would be intuitive that you go into an airlock, you turn around, you close the door behind you because it's an airlock, and then you turn around and you go out the external door, and heaps and heaps of people would just open one door, walk through, open the other door, die.
So you mentioned Infocom before. That kind of reminds me of some of the incredibly harsh puzzles in games like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where you do just the tiniest little thing and that's it, you'd be instantly dead, and it was so frustrating.
Yeah, except this time you got to see it in vivid black and white.
But the game itself, if you can get past the difficulty, is actually fascinating. There's a really intriguing story, and the world building, I think, is really interesting. I had a lot of fun playing it with a cheat app to give me like infinite health so that I didn't have to worry about getting killed all the time.
Yeah, and I guess we've always got YouTube videos of walkthroughs if you need a bit of a helping hand these days, which we didn't have back in the day. Well, I mean, as we got into the 90s, I mean, obviously id Software became, the kings of the FPS genre, and you've had both John Romero and John Carmack on the documentary, so tell us a bit about, talking to them about those early days when they were getting into the genre and their entry into it. What did you learn from them?
Yeah, so for the interviews, I conducted all of those, and Richard and I would put questions together. There were definitely games that he knew better than I did and vice versa, so we'd start with some questions and then always have the other read over them to see if there was anything we could add. For id Software, definitely made my favorite first-person shooters with the exception of Half-Life, so I've talked to Romero and Carmack both, as well as Tom Hall, Adrian Carmack, etc., several times. So for those interviews in particular, I was you can ask Richard, I was getting like ultra specific with some of the questions because I knew they'd answered them before and I knew they'd answer them now, but on film, and we could use it for some great segments. So I think that from them, we really made a point to talk about not just how the games were made, but how the atmosphere affected players, how important Doom's lighting was to its atmosphere, because I've always been a firm believer that Doom, particularly the original, is an action horror game as much as it is an action game. It's why I prefer it over Doom 2, even though Doom 2 has a much more balanced set of monsters to fight. So that was fun. And then Quake, we got Carmack and Romero and Adrian Carmack all to talk about just how difficult Quake's development was. Not many people, very, very few, had made true 3D engines, and none had made one that approached the sophistication of Quake. So that's something we wanted to do with the documentary. We didn't want it all to be happy-go-lucky, nostalgic, if you will. We wanted to get into some really truth-telling in there as well.
And you mentioned, Wolfenstein 3D, obviously that was kind of the, I guess we call it the first, today it would be a AAA game, wouldn't it? Even though it was a shareware model, which was quite interesting. I mean, do you think the fact that those early id games, were, Wolfenstein 3D and Doom in particular, were shareware, did that model help with their popularity?
It definitely
massively
did. Yeah. I mean, even Carmack said, this is where an asterisk comes in, like, Carmack said Doom was installed on more computers than the latest version of Windows, which would be 95. But of course, Windows 95 was not free. The Doom shareware episode was. So that's kind of an asterisk there. But also, this is kind of something that, and I want Richard to jump in with me as well. But one reason we showed games like Maze and The Colony was because very few people had heard of them. And you ask yourself why? Well, you had to have very specific computers and equipment to play them, whereas Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, anyone that had a PC with back then very kind of more or less rudimentary specs could get a free copy of the shareware episodes and play them. But that wasn't the case with these older games. And in fact, id Software made FPS games before Wolfenstein. They made Hover Tank and Catacomb 3D, but those were distributed again to a very small subscription base of Softdisk magazine subscribers. So that just kind of influenced the first FPS anyone would play, and why it was usually one of those popular id games.
Yeah, and Wolfenstein 3D and Doom were basically the perfect shareware games, because the whole shareware model is based upon making people want to download the thing because there's a bit of buzz, there's a bit of hype going around, and they're like, okay, this is worth downloading, or it's worth paying $5 to buy a disc from some catalog or from a store, or there's even like vending machines you could get them from in some areas. And then when you play the thing, a really good shareware game would just wow you. It'd be something you've not seen before, you've not experienced before, and you feel you have to have more of that. And that's what Wolfenstein 3D and Doom both did. They were both something new that people hadn't experienced before, and they made such a strong first impression. I know probably millions of people have only ever actually played the first episode of each of them, but millions thought, I've got to have more of this, and they found a way to give id Software money so they could buy the rest of the episodes, or they waited a couple of years for the retail releases.
Yeah, that's what happened to me, actually, Richard. Well, that little old lady gave me the Wolfenstein shareware, and I kind of thought that was the game, but it wasn't until Doom when, at the end, you'd have those end screens saying, like, oh, you've only played like a third of the game, or in Wolfenstein's case, a sixth. And if you call this number and give us, a credit card number, and I actually had my mom, I think I was 11 when Doom came out. I had my mom call, and she gave their credit card number to these weird people in Texas, and Doom came like 3 weeks later. It's very exciting.
Your mum was very trusting of you.
Yeah, she was. I mean, she was letting me play Mortal Kombat and stuff. The deal was, David, if you start going around trying to rip someone's heads off, you will be grounded. And I thought, well, I don't want that, so I never tried to kill anyone.
I mean, I've still got a vivid memory of seeing Wolfenstein 3D, as a kid for the first time in randomly a shop that sold stationery, like pens and pencils, and they had a word processing PC in there that someone had booted up Wolfenstein 3D on, and I think it was probably the fact that it could run on so many systems, because obviously we'll get into the increasing hardware requirements as the 90s went on, particularly with id games, but I think that was probably an aspect of it that it would work on a lot of PCs that people already had, I imagine.
It was the Street Fighter 2 of computer games. You just saw it everywhere, not just in arcades, not just at home in Wolfenstein's case. But yeah, I mean, this old lady, again, in my mom's medical class was playing Wolfenstein while the students were, doing whatever they were doing. It was almost ubiquitous back then, at least for me.
Well, how important was Wolfenstein's 3D's hidden rooms to the genre? Because I heard they were a bit of an afterthought, which I found quite surprising when watching the documentary.
Yeah, they provide a sense of discovery that people they love. And yet they were something that Carmack didn't want to do because they're sort of a hack. And Carmack, being the amazing engineer, programmer person that he is, he likes to have clean, pure code that is as perfect as possible. He doesn't want there to be flaws in his engine, much less intentional flaws that he's intentionally coded in there so that something like walls that you can push in and get behind would require that they do. But Tom Hall basically talked him into it, and it worked brilliantly. And that, I think, ended up being one of the most memorable things about the game, as they'd sort of whisper to each other about, oh, did you know you could get behind the wall there and there's some cool thing, there's some hidden Easter egg at this point here. And that idea then became a really core part of Doom and Doom 2 and onwards into the whole genre, that you'd have hidden things in the levels.
It definitely felt exciting in that early era, the pre-internet days, because it would be kind of, the legend that would be whispered around the school playgrounds, and you'd read it in magazines, and then it would inspire people to go home and boot the game up and try it for themselves, and there's that sense of magic when you discovered something that kind of felt like a hidden thing that not many people knew about in the game. It must have been quite magical.
It's so funny as well to think about now that back before we had easy walkthroughs and stuff, they'd boot up the game and they'd hear that you can get into some of the walls, that there are these push wall things, and so they'd just run around the entire game running into every wall just to see if maybe this is somewhere that you can get into.
Yeah, it was funny in Wolfenstein because, when you would press use, or I guess open, it would have been called then, you just got a little buzz if there was nothing to find there, at least if you had a Sound Blaster card. But in Doom, you'd hear, So my friends and I had a much cruder expression for testing walls.
The mind is working overtime now.
Yeah. But I mean, I think Scott Miller put it best in our documentary when he said that these secrets gave you the impression of there being more to the world just than what you can see by default. I remember as a kid, I actually found the secret level. One of the jokes among the id guys was that they were basically making Pac-Man with guns, because they knew even back then Wolfenstein 3D was visually impressive, but they were even getting bored making mazes because there was nothing really to it. The lighting was all flat and the same. There were no height maps. It was just maze, kill. And so, as a joke, there is actually a secret level where you can run around and you have to run away from the ghosts from Pac-Man and find the exit.
Yeah, stuff like that shows they had a great sense of humor as well, and enjoyed what they were doing while they were making it, which is fun. And obviously when Doom came along, I mean, I remember that being such an event, and because around that time I still had an Amiga. That was my main machine. I had a lot of friends that had Amigas, but all of a sudden, one by one, suddenly everyone started selling up and changing over to PCs just for this one game.
Sure.
So what do you think made Doom so special, and why are people still playing that game 30 years later?
Oh, I can start us off with this, because Doom is my favorite FPS of all time, and I would argue the greatest, the most influential. Doom feels good. Even nearly 30 years later, 30 this December, it is smooth. The sense of speed is perfect. The feedback on the weapons is perfect. The lighting is so atmospheric. It draws you in the same way as a film, like Aliens would. Fighting the monsters, just that sense of a 3D world, even though it wasn't true 3D. I mean, the first time I saw fireballs go like whizzing over my head and explode on a wall behind me, it was just the most immersive thing I've ever played. And I think Doom is still played today because the modding community is still making levels for it. And why are they doing that? I think it's because Doom, when John Carmack released the source code, a mere 4 years after Doom came out, which is always surprising to think about, he knew that people would have a blast with it and keep it updated. And the people have. There are all these source ports you can play that modernize the game in different ways. You can turn on free aim, jumping, crouching. Now, I'm a purist. I don't use any of that stuff. But the fact that it's there means that new audiences can appreciate this almost 30-year-old game. And veteran Doom Space Marines like me can always go back and find something to appreciate.
And I think when the World Wide Web started to get popular, or even FTP sites, suddenly you started seeing directories full of WAD files, and that just gave the game a whole new dimension, didn't it? It just kept it going and going.
Yeah, that was a big part of Doom's appeal, and Wolfenstein didn't do that. I also think that, I mean, obviously Deathmatch was groundbreaking. It's not something I really played. I just had a modem, and it was like a 14.4 baud modem, so you weren't really doing any deathmatching on that. But that was a huge part of it too. You know, they're the age-old stories of Doom multiplayer games just bringing university and business networks to their knees because so many people were playing Doom Deathmatch.
I remember getting banned off our network at school. Yeah,
you do what you have to do, man. If you got to play Doom, you do what you got to do.
Yeah, people are trying to save documents and it's not working because there's no bandwidth left on the network.
Yeah, I would make jokes with Richard and with Robin. I'm like, so this is just a Doom documentary with a few other FPS games sprinkled in around it, right? That's what we're doing here. I had to be reined in a few times, I think.
Well, how much would you say the FPS genre contributed to hardware sales, you know, particularly in the mid-90s? Because, I mean, I mentioned about, you know, my friends buying PCs to play Doom. Remember when Quake came along and suddenly we had things like, you know, hardware 3D rendering that started getting more demanding. I do remember it was a time of, you know, regularly upgrading graphics cards if you want to be at the top of your game.
Yeah, it was really from Quake onwards that shooters were driving the technology evolution, and most of that was down to Carmack specifically and his push to keep just pushing the needle of what graphics could do, and working closely with the graphics cards manufacturers to make his 3D engines super optimized with their 3D cards. And if you were a gamer, you wanted to have Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament, and that was like right at the end of the 90s. That was the big thing. Everyone had to get a new PC if they wanted to play those and play them at good quality settings, because everything had moved so quickly. Like, we can forget now where things are moving pretty slowly, and you can have a 5-year-old PC and still run the latest and greatest software, like 60 frames a second, and it looks great. Back then, things were cycling so quickly that every year you've got something that's suddenly obsolete. You need to upgrade if you want to keep up to date, if you want to be able to keep running the things. And I remember with Half-Life even, my brother had a laptop for his school, and he got Half-Life on it, and it ran like a slideshow. It was hilarious trying to go through that scene at the beginning where you're on the subway train thing, and I'm just watching it at maybe 5 frames a second, and I was still spellbound by it because it was such a great scene. But his computer didn't have a high-end graphics card, and so because of how things were working back in those days, you basically couldn't run it at all.
Well, Half-Life's a good title to discuss as well, because, I mean, obviously before that, it just kind of felt like FPS games were really all about the action, the shooting, they're just getting in there. But it felt like, narrative and real in-depth story kind of came to the genre with Half-Life. Would that be fair to say?
Well, it had been tried before Half-Life, but Half-Life was the one that finally got it right, because we've got this great line in the film where one of the Team Fortress creators is saying it wasn't the story in Half-Life that was groundbreaking. It was the way the story was told. That way that it keeps you in control the entire time. You don't get cutaways to a cutscene. You are in control of Gordon Freeman the entire time. You can look the other way and walk to the edge of the room when someone's talking, or you can stand right behind their head or something and having a laugh to yourself that you are making fun of the way the scripts have been written. But it's so well scripted and so dynamic in its environmental storytelling that it changed the way people thought about storytelling in video games. And no one before Half-Life had really gotten it right.
Well, it felt like the genre became more accessible from the mid-90s onwards as well, because obviously consoles became 3D capable then, and we started to see some actually really good ports to even systems like the Atari Jaguar had a great version of Doom on there. PlayStation obviously had great versions. It was the N64, its kind of own custom version of Doom that was completely different to everything else. But I think there's one game that I remember some of all my friends really getting into, and that of course was GoldenEye. When that came along, that kind of felt like the first game that was really geared towards full-on multiplayer first and just that fun experience. I mean, how did kind of having that multiplayer aspect, the couch gaming aspect of console FPS games change the genre?
So the irony of GoldenEye being this beloved multiplayer title is that it wasn't really ever planned, and it kind of came together near the end of development. We go over this in the documentary, but the GoldenEye team would kind of relax during their lunch breaks by playing Super Bomberman, and they really liked the split screen aspect of it. So they just started tooling around with GoldenEye and working on multiplayer. And they even had, their contact at Nintendo come to visit and say, "What are you guys doing?" And they would "Oh, we're making multiplayer." And he was like, "That's nice, but you're not contracted for that. Could you finish what we're paying you to do?" And, even Carl Hilton, one of the artists, said, "Yeah, that's totally fair." But they all really liked playing multiplayer, and so they got it up and running. And that became this pivotal part of the game. I know that I would have friends over, and my sister's friends would hang out too. And it was like an arcade, like people were kind of not exactly in a line, but they would just kind of mill around until a controller opened up, and then they would take it over. And there was just... Even today, that's one of Nintendo's focuses in particular. You have online multiplayer in a lot of their first-party games, but local play is just something special. And I think that was that communal aspect of GoldenEye's multiplayer was what really made it a mainstay, and still is today. I mean, a lot of it was eclipsed very quickly, especially in terms of controls by other first-person shooters, but the way I think of GoldenEye is that it was kind of the Wolfenstein 3D to Halo's Doom, at least on consoles.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the documentary itself, and obviously we'll let people know, and I'll link up, how people can get hold of it and watch it. And one thing I loved, watching the early screener that you guys were kind enough to share with me was how you managed to balance the technical aspects of game development and the more human stories of the creators behind the game. I mean, was that quite a balance to do then, so it wasn't too techy, but you actually got those human stories in there too?
Yeah, it was very deliberate, and it's something that I really wanted to focus on. I'm sure Richard and Chris agreed with me, but I didn't want this to just be kind of a reel of epic moments and I remember that from my childhood and yada yada. I wanted to tell a lot of these stories, and I think that's what Robin Block was consistently impressed. He's the first person to admit that he's not much of a gamer, but he really enjoyed the stories behind a lot of these games that Richard and I told through the scripts and that Chris brought to life through his editing. So I think that's important to remember, is that these are people who were responsible for your favorite games. And the cool thing about our cast, which is almost 50 gaming legends strong, is that a lot of these people never really got much credit for what they did, and so we're kind of giving them a limelight now, which is fun.
I mean, it was largely intentional that it would be something that a general audience could enjoy, because people dip in and out of genres. We're making this primarily for the fans, but we want it to be an introduction to people. Whatever their experience level is. Maybe they are really hardcore into retro shooters and they're perfect. They're our exact audience, but then maybe they're into modern shooters, like they love playing Call of Duty or any of the big things like PUBG or whatever nowadays. And this is their chance to find out about all the rich history behind the genre. Or maybe they just played like GoldenEye and Halo and they adored those games, and now they're like, well, what was going on the PC side that was interesting? And this is their chance to learn those stories. Or they were really into PC shooters and they ignored the console side, and they can learn about that. There aren't going to be that many people watching this who've played every game, and so we had to approach every segment as something that is accessible and approachable, and we're not assuming knowledge other than the absolute basics of gamer jargon.
Yeah, to kind of add on to that, everything Richard said is spot on. We didn't want to assume anything, but we also look for opportunities, going back to what we said earlier about Battlezone and Maze and the Colony, to kind of subvert expectations. And one way Chris and I did that was with the intro, where all of our credits are rolling on the screen and it's transitioning through all these really AAA first-person shooters like Doom, Halo, GoldenEye. And I wanted to show those specifically because I think a lot of people, like we said earlier, would probably go into this assuming that the documentary is going to start with an id Software FPS. So then you see kind of the who's who and you're getting excited like, yeah, Duke Nukem and Half-Life, awesome. And then you're like, wait, Maze? What is this? And so it was a way to kind of prime people in the know for these legends yet to come. But hey, we're going to take you back and show you some games that many of you have either never heard of or have never thought of as FPS games.
We touched as well on the social aspect of it before. People booting up copies of Doom on their network at work, for example, or school. But obviously, as the 90s progressed, LAN parties became such a big deal. And even, the early 2000s as well. And even today, when I go to retro gaming expos, you're always guaranteed to see a table of original Xboxes set up with Halo running on there and a little mini LAN party going on. Do you kind of touch on the significance of LAN parties and how important were they to the evolution of the genre? Do you talk about that in the documentary?
Yeah, I wrote a segment that's all about the LAN party culture and the rise of esports, and it all ties into Doom and deathmatch and even like way back at Maze in the beginning, you've got people playing these games against each other. For so many people, that's what the appeal is. It's being able to shoot your buddies and have a good laugh as you're playing along, and screaming from the next room or yelling into a headset or typing something into the chat box, because it's really fun to play against other people. And I have my own personal memories of going to LAN cafes in the early 2000s to play Counter-Strike and Battlefield 1942 with my friends, and because I had a Mac at home, getting absolutely annihilated by them because I'd never practiced, and this was the only time I'd ever play these games, but still having a blast.
That sounds awesome. I would love for you and I to talk more about that. I've never been to a LAN cafe, but like Richard, I have my own memories. Every year until I think 2019 was the last year we did it, because then we all decided to like get married and move to the four corners of the earth. But I have my close friends from high school, and from middle school until 2019, we would meet at Jeff's house every New Year's Eve, and it was like some great ceremony. We would all park and spend like 30 minutes carrying in our towers, our CRTs, our mice, our keyboard, our Sidewinder game pads, whatever we needed. We would get the computers all set up. One year we were waylaid by what Windows 98 called a network bridge, which worked the opposite of how you would think. The bridge was not letting us connect, and I feel like that's what bridges are meant to do. So we had to troubleshoot that. But we would play Quake, we would play Half-Life, and you know, there are these little things, especially if you know the group of people that you kind of look to every year. Like one of our friends, Mike, was probably the least skilled. So if a game was coming down to the wire, we were each tied at like 19 kills apiece out of 20. The three of us would go Mike hunting just to get that last easy kill to be the winner. So yeah, I love LAN parties, and Richard did a great job with that segment.
There's something so nostalgic about, you know, seeing images from those times as well. When, yeah, I mean, you're right, you know, kids carrying like the massive PC tower cases and these big 21-inch CRTs around. It's like, I look at my little nephew now and he takes his Nintendo Switch around to his friend's house, and I'm like, yeah, that's why you haven't got muscles. That's what, you know, you need to carry those big monitors.
It was all about health and staying in shape. That's what PC gaming was about.
Never mind the 4 liters of cola that you drink while you're gaming.
Well, you have to gain back some mass. You have to cultivate mass after all that work.
Oh, I mean, also, we kind of touched on the WAD files on Doom as well. I mean, what about the communities that are around these games as well? I mean, which ones are still kind of the most active in terms of FPS games, and do you cover much of the modding scene in the documentary?
Yeah, we didn't have as much room as I wanted. Unfortunately, when you're trying to cover something that's so big and broad in scope, some stuff has to be sort of shunted aside, or it has to get less attention than you want. As it happened, because I was writing that script and a few other scripts at the end of the project, we were like way over length, and we had to pull things back, and so I ended up having to cut down the scope for these segments. So modding was going to be sort of looking at the culture of modding a bit more broadly, and it was going to get into the Quake era and Half-Life era of modding to set up for mods becoming commercial games. But because of time constraints, I had to really hone it in on just a couple of stories that I thought were really strong, which are basically the birth of modding in the early Doom days, with people first starting to tinker with the Doom editing utility, the DEU, which was this DOS program where you were sort of going around and creating the geometry for the levels, all very much manually, and it's quite hard to use. But you could even load up id Software's levels and change them, and for many people that was their entry point to modding. It was they would take E1M1 and they'd change something. Like one of the guys that we interviewed, Richard Gray, who was a level designer on Duke Nukem 3D and one of the co-creators of Sin, and a very famous game designer. His entry point to FPS games was hearing about this DEU, not believing it could possibly be a thing, and then booting it up on his PC and thinking, okay, I'm just going to open up this window that you can't go through at the beginning of E1M1 of Doom, and then I'll be able to go through it. And so he moved the top and the bottom of the window so that he could walk through, and he got into this area that probably no one had ever been into before. And then he was hooked. He had to start making stuff, and so he would make his own levels and share them on the internet, which is also what happened with this guy who made a very famous mod called Aliens TC, and that was sort of the main story that I told in this segment, was the creation of that mod, which is a phenomenal total conversion. It was the first total conversion mod of Doom to become basically a game version of Aliens. the classic sci-fi horror film. And it's incredible game. This mod thing, the whole first level is really atmospheric, and you don't even shoot anyone. You just go around and get freaked out by how moody the world is, and in my case, get lost.
Some of the creativity in those, it's just jaw-dropping, isn't it?
So, Richard and I became virtual actors for much of this movie. There were two ways we would get gameplay or capture gameplay. One was for our backers who pledged at or above a certain level. I think it was Quake Guy, but I don't really know the tiers.
Yep.
Okay, Quake Guy. So they could record, I'll let Richard talk more about this, but he kind of let them know what we're looking for, and they could send in their gameplay clips. But a lot of the clips, such as when you look at Maze War, The Colony, in Doom Aliens TC, Richard played that. And I have played a lot of the games as well, all the id games, Half-Life. And you don't just, normally, when you play FPS games, especially on the PC, you're circle strafing, you're bunny hopping, you're rocket jumping, you're doing other jargony things. But for this, we really had to slow down, turn off the HUDs to see as much of the game world as possible, usually use cheat codes, not only so we could survive things, but also so the screen wouldn't like flash red when you get hit or anything distracting like that, and kind of play the game in a way that would accompany the story being told. Like when in the Doom segment, John Romero talks about how the first room that he made in Doom that really kind of set the tone for the level design. And, it started out with really kind of static ceiling heights like Wolfenstein, but he said, no, he wants to raise the ceiling. And so I actually captured that level, and Chris did an effect where he kind of pulled the ceiling up. He stretched it so that we could show it getting taller. And then I used cheat codes to turn the lights on and off, things like that. And it was really a lot of fun. There was another instance where John described, picking up a blue key card, the lights go out and you're ambushed from behind. So I would spin around in that level when the lights went off, and then kind of shake my mouse like, oh, I'm so scared, to kind of, bring some visuals to the story. It was a lot of fun. But Richard's work with Maze War and The Colony in particular were great.
Yeah, how did you approach those, Richard?
With Maze War, it was really just a matter of how can I get this thing working? Because this is a 1973 game that was made for a mini computer and a mainframe acting in concert together. The mini computer would talk to the mainframe, which is sort of the referee of the match, and is keeping track of everyone's computers and making sure they're all synced up. And so I had to find an emulator and build it for Linux because it doesn't work properly on Windows or Mac, and then figure out with someone's help how to use it. And then because it's a multiplayer game, just play with robot players and then go around and try and make it as exciting as you possibly can when you've just got an empty black world with lines for the world, for definitions. Or I'm like typing in messages like gotcha and stuff to try and make it a bit more fun and dynamic. And Chris did a brilliant job lifting it even more with his editing. And using some things that I didn't think he'd use, that I just sort of left in my clips because it was easier than editing to leave in, like me typing in, and even with typos, typing in the command to go into the world to play Maze. And he did a really cool transition thing using that early in the film. And then with The Colony, it was taking the script just as David had done, and trying to get footage to, as best I could, match what is going on there. And so we've got, in the interview, David Allen Smith is describing this experience he had of walking down a corridor, and he knows that the game is going to crash when he turns the corner, but he's so drawn into this world that he's created that he doesn't want to stop. He wants to see what's around the corner. And so I went like all over the game trying to find a good hallway that I could use for this single clip. And I've eventually found a couple.
Well, I mean, the amount of effort you put into it, I mean, it definitely shows. I mean, visually, it's an absolutely gorgeous film. You put so much work into that, and it really shines. And the documentary has some fascinating interviews in there as well. We already talked about John Romero and John Carmack as well. I mean, David, who else did you talk to for the documentary? Are there any other people we should look out for, and any memorable moments maybe from the interviews that stand out for you?
So we have a cast of 48 legendary designers, pro players, and subject matter experts, much like Richard and myself. And interviewing all of them was particularly fun. I really liked talking to Dennis Fong, who was known as Thresh, because this is something Richard and I talked about. It's almost a semantics issue. In the movie, his lower third, his name on the screen is his title is First Pro Gamer. And of course, there were gamers before him, such as Becky Berger Heinemann, who had won gaming events. Like, she won this big Space Invaders competition that hosted by Atari, I think. But we decided, the difference there is that Dennis was the first person who didn't just win a tournament. He was playing games professionally. That was his job. He was a pro cyber athlete, if you will. So hearing those stories from Dennis was really cool. And he'd sent me he found this YouTube video of Doom's Deathmatch 95 tournament hosted by Microsoft, but I couldn't find it. And Richard did include it in his script From Lands to Legends about the rise of esports. So it was really cool to see that in there. And one of the ways we promoted the movie, actually, I got to go with Dennis to Las Vegas last October. There was the EBS, the Esports Business Summit, and every year they induct someone into their Hall of Fame, and I got to go on stage and induct Dennis into the Hall of Fame. So it was kind of a really cool extension of the film, just getting to spend more time with him and talk with him. I'm sure Richard has some moments that stood out to him in the interviews as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many great things that came up in the interviews, because not everything, unfortunately, was able to make it into the film, because we're talking to people for an hour, 2 hours each, and 48 people. That's we recorded something like 80 hours of interview footage, and as long as the film is 4.5 hours, is a lot less than 80 hours. But I think for me, a lot of the highlights are actually coming from Warren Spector, who took the interview very seriously. He's a very deep thinker, and he had, I thought, some pretty profound insights into game design and into why we play games, as well as some inspirational words about wanting games to be more than they are, to make games not just something that's a fun experience, but something that will change who you are as a person. And he speaks with such cachet and wisdom that I think it's a real highlight having him in the documentary, as much as it was difficult editing him, because he says a lot of words and he speaks quite slowly. But we figured it out, and we made him sound really good.
Well, guys, I know there's been several years put into this project, and anyone that loves first-person shooters, that genre that is the biggest genre in video games today, just has to watch this. Real love letter to it, and like I said, 4.5 hours. I mean, you're not going to get much more in depth, and you've got plenty of content there for a director's cut one day as well, I imagine. But for now, that 4.5 hours, just absolutely incredible. So I know that everyone listening to this will be like, well, how do we watch it then? So how can people get hold of it?
Well, go to from July 6th until August 1st. You can order the movie at FPSdoc, that's doc.com. I believe we're planning to ship, quote unquote, digital versions in August, and the physical editions will ship out later this late summer, early fall. And you can also follow us on Twitter at FPSdoc, where we will be, of course, sharing where you can buy the film. And also, we have a lot of surprises filled for the month that the movie will be available for order. Some behind-the-scenes clips, some excerpts from the movie, some creator interviews, all sorts of fun stuff planned.
Wonderful. Well, I'll put a link in our show notes so everyone can just click straight through to it. David and Richard, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on and doing some FPS reminiscing, and best of luck with it.
Yeah, thank you very much.